Welcome to the Think JSAR webinar series, brought to you by the Office of the Vice Provost for Strategic Engagement. Today, we are pleased to present a distinguished guest speaker. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSAO network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, or U.S. SOCOM.
Hello and good day to everyone. My name is Terry Doan, and I'm from the Department of Applied Soft Art here at the Joint Special Operations University. I want everyone to this online interview, part of Think JSAO. Think JSAO is an ongoing series that explores the research and analysis efforts of the JSAO faculty, leading academics, and the wider soft and international security community. This online collection includes interviews with authors and researchers and is intended to supplement publications, articles, and other active discussions. I would encourage everyone to explore the complete Think JSAO collection by reviewing our online offerings on YouTube. Over the last year, with concurrence from enterprise commanders and command senior enlisted leaders, JSAO has identified 5 mutually reinforcing learning pathways, which both illuminate and advance learning in 5 identified joint soft common core knowledge competency areas. One of those learning pathways is on joint soft support to strategic influence through information advantage. That will provide the focus for our discussion today. The 2022 National Defense Strategy identifies 5 persistent threats posed by potential adversaries. One of those adversaries is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK, North Korea. While not receiving as much international attention today as China's malign activities in the Asia-Pacific region or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, North Korea's threat to the United States is steadily increasing. Not only is North Korea improving its relationships with both Russia and China, its continuing development and refinement of both nuclear warheads and delivery systems capable of reaching the United States are potential game changers. Its work with hypersonic missiles could render them even more difficult for friendly countermeasures to defeat. From a soft perspective, North Korea's Special Operations Force is the largest in the world, believed to exceed 200,000 personnel. The North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, is the grandson of North Korea's founder, Kim Il-sung. While it does not appear that he has strayed too far from his grandfather's ultimate objectives, his capacity and capability to achieve them has grown significantly. Today, Colonel Retired Dave Maxwell joins us to discuss a concept that probably does not get the attention that it may well deserve: an influence and information campaign in support of U.S. national objectives regarding North Korea. Colonel Maxwell is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the former associate director of the Center for Security Studies and the Security Studies program in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He is a 30-year veteran of the U.S. Army, retiring in 2011 as a Special Forces colonel, with his final assignment being on the military faculty teaching national security strategy at the National War College. While in the Army, Colonel Maxwell served in various command and staff assignments in the infantry in Germany and Korea, as well as in special forces at Fort Lewis, Washington, Seoul, Korea, Okinawa, Japan, and the Philippines, with total service in Asia of more than 20 years. He served on the United Nations Command, Combined Forces Command, USFK CJ3 staff, where he was a planner for UNC CFCO Plan 502798, and co-author of the ROC JCS UNC CFC Con Plan 502999 on North Korean instability and collapse, and later served as the Director of Plans, Policy, and Strategy, J5, of the Special Operations Command Korea, or SOCOR. He knows a little bit about the Korean problem set. Personally, I've had the privilege of calling him a friend for close to 35 years. During our discussion today, if you have a question for Colonel Maxwell, please identify yourself and submit the question using the Q&A icon on the bottom of your screen. Dave, welcome to JSAO, and thank you for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you, Terry. It's great to see you. A long time since we were together on the DMZ in Korea, and of course, thank you also to JSOW for hosting this event and this series that I think is providing so much value to the special operations community and the broader national security community. So, thank you.
Well, Dave, thanks again. Let me begin by asking what you believe to be the short-term, mid-term, and long-term intents of the DPRK regime.
That's a great question, and I think that's really important to start out with that to understand what is happening on the Korean Peninsula. We really need to try to understand, and of course, I think we'd all agree there are no experts on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea is a proverbial hard target, and Pyongyang is a black hole. But I think in the short term, and what we've seen really since 2017. And its last nuclear test and last major ICBM test, although there have been a couple since then. Since it was sanctioned, the near-term intent for Kim Jong-un is to get sanctions relief. Escapees from North Korea tell me that his failure to get sanctions relief from President Trump and President Moon is one of the biggest failures of the regime. And so everything we're seeing right now that he's doing is focused on that short-term objective, which is get sanctions relief. They use political warfare and blackmail diplomacy, which is the use of provocations, increased threats, and tensions to gain political and economic concessions. The midterm, and really the foundational intent of the regime is, of course, deterrence of attack and survival of the regime. And some people think survival of the regime is the ultimate end state, but really the long-term objective to ensure survival is domination of the peninsula. Domination of the peninsula under the rule of what I like to call the guerrilla dynasty and gulag state of North Korea. And of course, if you read their constitution, you read their party documents, you read their statements, particularly the last major one from the Eighth Party Congress, domination of the peninsula, completion of the revolution, ridding the peninsula of foreign influence is the ultimate objective for the regime. And of course, by doing so, that will ensure survival of the Kim family regime. So that's really, in a nutshell, the short-term, midterm, and long-term objectives.
Okay, and David, are there North Korean courses of action that you might consider as being either the most likely or most dangerous? What do you think they're likely to do?
Well, I think what we're seeing is really a two-track approach. One is political warfare, which I've really kind of outlined, but it also includes the subversion of the ROK political system and South Korean society. Infiltration using the United Front Department, the 225th Bureau, and really to undermine the ROK political system and ultimately to make it collapse. So that's its political warfare strategy. And again, we see so much of what it's doing with its propaganda and agitation department, its provocations, its deception, and some, I like to call it the long con, and using all of their instruments of power to really try to subvert the ROK as well as the international community, but primarily South Korea. Of course, the most dangerous is war. And that's really, they have a war plan. And of course, they've developed nuclear weapons, extensive array of missile capabilities, up to including tested ICBMs that potentially can range the homeland of the United States. And so warfighting is the ultimate and most dangerous course of action. And so political warfare to warfighting. And I think that we've got a plan for both of those. Now, in between, we see these series of tests and provocations, we call them, and they're usually twofold. We tend to assess them as messaging and really putting pressure on us and really making demands for some kind of concession. But every test is also advancing its warfighting capabilities. And it's really important to note that inside North Korea, Kim Jong-un has made the deliberate decision to prioritize the development of nuclear weapons, missile capabilities, advanced warfighting capabilities at the expense of the Korean people living in the North. And so, We see this tremendous suffering. People like to blame it on, of course, the failed economy, on environmental problems, natural disasters. But really, the problems that exist in North Korea are the deliberate decisions, deliberate policy decisions that Kim Jong-un has made to prioritize his military and advanced warfighting capabilities over the welfare of the people. So it is really focused on ultimately dominating the peninsula to ensure survival of the regime. Now, you asked about most likely, most dangerous. I like to talk about the big five for Korea and really characterize the problem that way. Of course, war is the worst case, as I've mentioned. The second one is instability and regime collapse. And this is a real problem. We are unlikely to see the same kind of collapse that we saw at the end of the Cold War or unification of East and West Germany. The conditions that lead to instability and regime collapse could lead Kim Jong-un to make the decision to go to war as the only way to survive. As far-fetched as that seems to us, that may be his calculus. The third of my big five are human rights and crimes against humanity. People wonder why I focus on human rights so much, but I will tell you that human rights is not only a moral imperative, it's a national security issue. And one of the main reasons for that is that Kim Jong-un has to deny the human rights of the Korean people in the North in order to survive. And of course, the United Nations, Mr. Kirby from Australia, who wrote the Commission of Inquiry in 2014 for the United Nations, they identified the human rights abuses and crimes against humanity as really the worst since World War II. And so these human rights are being perpetrated against the Korean people. What is interesting and something that we need to understand is that the more we focus on North Korea's nuclear program, the more we legitimize the regime. But when we focus on human rights, it undermines the legitimacy of the regime. And we've seen this over time and how North Korea responds. Usually admit nothing, deny everything, and make counter accusations. But they've responded to our human rights focus, and they are upset by it. And they're really upset by it because it informs the Korean people in the North about their situation, something which they have little understanding about because of their isolation. And so we need to think about how we approach information to North Korea. And again, understand that the focus on the nuclear threat legitimizes the regime. The focus on human rights undermines the regime. The fourth of the big five is, of course, the asymmetric capabilities the North has developed. Of course, this full spectrum of weapons of mass destruction, not only nuclear, but chemical and biological as well. It's global illicit activities, starting with counterfeiting our $100 bills, counterfeiting cigarettes, counterfeiting drugs, including Viagra. It's drug trafficking and methamphetamines. It's global slave labor. It's money laundering. All of these illicit activities that occur around the world are all designed to gain hard currency for the regime and help the regime to survive financially. And then we also have to talk about proliferation of weapons and training to conflict areas, primarily in the Middle East and Africa. And many conflict areas are receiving everything from small arms up to Scud missiles. Scud missiles we see fired from Yemen, provided by Iran, firing into Saudi Arabia, are from North Korea. And so we see all of these types of activities that North Korea conducts around the world, which really makes it a global problem. And the last of the big five is not a threat. It's a challenge, and it's really the solution to the problem in the Korean Peninsula, and that is unification, a free and unified Korea. In paragraph 60 of the Armistice Agreement in 1953, it called on all the parties to come together within 90 days to solve the political problem of the Korean Peninsula, the Korea question, which is the unnatural division of the peninsula. We're more than 7 decades, almost 7 decades since 1953, and we still haven't solved that problem. But that is really what is going to bring about peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, ultimately unification, and I'll talk more about that. But it would be the establishment of a united Republic of Korea, UROK, which you might pronounce as UROK.
Dave, one of the I guess the big differences between Kim Jong-un and his grandfather is the visibility and apparent importance of his sister Kim Yo-jong. What influence do you think she has over her brother's decisions?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think we can assess that she is likely the person that he trusts the most. And of course, since she really came to prominence during the 2018 Olympics when she traveled to Korea, sat in the same box as Vice President Pence, watching the opening ceremonies. She has really gained a lot of prominence, and she, holds many positions of importance. One being the Propaganda and Agitation Department, with her real mission is to enhance the reputation and legitimacy of her brother Kim Jong-un. She's been sanctioned because of her ties to human rights abuses, the gulags in North Korea. So she's an evil person. But the question is, how much influence does she have? She is one of the very few people who has issued statements, public statements, in her own name. Most all statements are issued by the North Korean media, the KCNA, the Propaganda and Agitation Department, with approval of Kim Jong-un. But she has issued a number of statements in her own name, to include in June of 2020, when she threatened South Korea because of what the escapees or defectors are doing, sending information into North Korea. She threatened South Korea to blow up the South Korean liaison building in Kaesong, and then she did it. And they blew up the building. And then 6 months later, South Korea, in the previous administration, passed the anti-leaflet law, which was really an appeasement of North Korea, because Kim Jong-un fears information. He fears information from the outside world. In fact, Dr. Jung Pak, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the assistant to Ambassador Sung Kim, who is the special representative for North Korea, she often asks, who is Kim Jong-un most afraid of, the United States military or the Korean people in the North? And it is, in fact, the Korean people in the North, armed with information, and particularly information about South Korea. So Kim Yo-jong she's been in and out of the spotlight. You see her at major events, but it's likely that she has great influence over Kim Jong-un. The real question is she being groomed for succession? And this is a question, North Korea is a patriarchal society, male-dominated society. Would they have a woman succeed? And the question is, what is more important? The traditional Confucian male-dominated society, or the bloodline, the Paektu bloodline, Paektu Mountain, where the myth of the Kim family regime stems from. She's a blood descendant of Kim Il-sung. And so if Kim Jong-un was to pass, would he have designated her as successor, or someone else, or perhaps a young son who was too young to assume immediate rule? Perhaps he would be designated the successor with Kim Yo-jong as the regent. The bottom line to your question, she wields a lot of influence, and she bears watching.
Dave, thanks. Dave, we've actually started to get a couple questions. Let me give you one from Pat Stevens. How are information operations being used by North Korea?
Oh, well, I think that's very well. In fact, now we listen and read North Korean propaganda. We often laugh at it because sometimes it is really over-the-top rhetoric. But actually, in most cases, they are transmitting messages, and often they are telling us what they are really going to do, and they are telling us what their demands are. So their propaganda and agitation department is very, very active. But much of their information, their influence operation, their propaganda is in some ways unsophisticated, old school, built on, as you're going to see now in coming months, and they've just started this, attacks of the president of South Korea. President Yoon is going to be attacked as a lackey of the United States. This successful summit that just occurred between President Yoon and President Biden, in which President Yoon has said, we've got to strengthen the alliance, and his and South Korea is aligned with the United States, really opens up South Korea and the president himself to criticism from the North. So they will use that. Now, in other areas, North Korea is developing cyber capabilities that are very extensive. Kim Jong-un calls the nuclear program their treasured sword, and their cyber capabilities are the all-purpose sword. And of course, they use that for stealing money, Bitcoin. They use it for attacking infrastructure, and they will also use it for spying, espionage, which they've just arrested a ROK Army captain and some other people for actually sending access to the combined communication system back to the North, and they will use it for influence. I think you can really see this in South Korea, just as we see this in the United States from China, from Russia, bots and the things like that. They're doing this extensively in South Korea and really trying to shape public opinion. We don't see it often in the United States and don't recognize it because it's in Korean, but they are playing an active role in South Korean social media, again, focused on subversion, on undermining the South Korean government and society.
Dave, Pat's got a couple more questions. One of them is the strategic communication used by the U.S. We'll get that a little bit later, but what's the strategic communications narrative used by North Korea?
Oh, well, that's a great question, and it's it really goes back to the founding of the regime, and this is the regime was founded, and the legitimacy of the regime rests on anti-Japanese partisan warfare, in that Kim Il-sung was the great guerrilla leader who liberated Korea from the Japanese in 1945. And they've created this myth that is a myth because Kim Il-sung, although did command the first of the 88th Special Independent Sniper Brigade, which was a Russian army unit, which is not acknowledged. His son Kim Jong-il was born in Russia, north of Vladivostok. They don't acknowledge that, but he commanded this unit. But for the most of the war of World War II, it didn't conduct any operations. In fact, he's only known to have conducted one operation, and that was an attack of a Japanese police box on the North Korean-Russian border, in which 15 Japanese policemen were killed. That's really the extent of his military prowess. But yet he built this into a great myth with the help of the Soviets, and then, of course, in 1948, really established North Korea and didn't participate in the UN, the nationwide UN mandated elections. So everything stems from this. And that's why I call them a guerrilla dynasty. And their party documents call for completing the revolution. They are a revolutionary country, communist, Confucius, and the amalgamation of all of that as Juche ideology. And this ideology is really what permeates, all of society. And not only the ideology, but also the social classification system. 51 classes of society called Songbun, which are really three major classes of the elite, the middle wavering class, and then the disloyal class. And all of this comes together to really define North Korean society and how it operates, and then how it fits in the world. Just to give you one interesting tidbit, during the arduous march of 1994 to 1996, the starvation period, in which as many as 3 million people may have died of the effects of the famine, The Economist from Great Britain did a surreptitious survey of Koreans and asked how many countries are there in the world. They asked of Korean people inside North Korea. And the answer was there are 5 countries in the world. And there is Russia, China, the United States, Japan, and North Korea. Those are the 5 countries of the world. All the rest of the countries are puppets of China, Russia, the United States, and Japan. And that's how they really define the world. That is, and that's how they put North Korea in its place, the only country to have able to resist domination by the world powers. And of course, now they're able to do that because of their nuclear weapons, what they will define as their advanced military, even though it's, full of obsolete, Soviet-based equipment and the like. But its nuclear weapons, its missile capabilities, make it a formidable threat, a dangerous threat. And so they use all of this to really have their narrative that they are independent, self-reliant, and they're able to hold their place in the world against these great powers, these major powers that surround them.
Dave, I got another question here. What is the proliferation of cellular technology among the population, and is there an increased use of social media applications in the North?
There are estimates of up to 6.5 million smartphones inside North Korea. There's an extensive network that does exist. A couple of years ago, I heard from the ambassador to Sweden when she left Pyongyang, and she stopped by Washington, D.C., as many diplomats do, and we were able to ask her questions. And I asked her a question, this very question: what is cell phone coverage like in North Korea? And her last thing she did, she took a trip from Pyongyang all the way east across the neck to Wonsan, and then all the way north to Haesong on the Chinese border, and then back to Pyongyang. And she told us that her North Korean cell phone had coverage the entire way. She said she had no gaps in coverage. And of course, when she got near Haesong, near the Chinese border, her Swedish cell phone connected to the international towers in China. So she was able to call internationally. Now, cell phones are really important in North Korea. They're important to the markets, the 400 markets that have grown since the arduous march, which is another story. They're also really important for escapees or defectors to send money back to families inside North Korea. They are able to use cell phone minutes as currency. They transfer these, and of course, the Inminban, the Communist Party leaders, the local leaders, and security officials, they know this, and now they tax that. The corruption. They know that money is being transferred. They allow it to happen because they're taking a cut. Cell phones, smartphones in North Korea are very important. Of course, like us, they play games on them. They watch videos, and of course, they have other devices for videos as well. But smartphone technology is really important. Martin Williams, who you can read his work at 38 North, he is one of the most expert people at tracking North Korean media. As Kim Yun-ho at George Washington University as well. They have published some really good work for an organization I belong to, the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea, and you can read about cell phones and information in some of the reports there, and I offer those up to you.
Thanks, Dave. Interestingly enough, we've got a question from George Schatzer that basically is exactly the same as the next question I was going to ask, so we're going to go ahead with that, which is, given the recent South Korean presidential election and the new administration of President Yoon Suk-yeol, what changes would you foresee in their response to and policies regarding North Korean intents?
Well, the most important change that we are seeing between the Moon administration to the Yoon administration is a better alignment about the assumptions of the nature, the objectives, and the strategy of Kim Jong-un. And I call two things to your attention. First is President Yoon's interview with the Washington Post just after he was elected, in which he stated that North Korea is the main enemy. That's a change from the last administration. The last administration, the president wanted to be the peace president, had a peace agenda, and was actually appeasing the regime in the North. The second is just after the summit, President Yoon gave an interview to CNN, and he stated unequivocally that there will be no more appeasement of North Korea. And so those two interviews really encapsulate the major change between the Moon and the Yoon administration. We are seeing a lot of alignment with the United States and our views towards readiness. There will be a reinvigoration of exercises in Korea to ensure the combined readiness of the ROK and U.S. forces. But like the Biden administration, the Yoon administration is also willing to engage. They are willing to engage. They will provide vaccines, humanitarian assistance to the suffering in the North. They offer that help as the United States has done, and they will engage without preconditions if Kim Jong-un is willing to come to the negotiating table. But Kim Jong-un has rebuffed all offers, both of talks and of receiving aid, receiving vaccines and other humanitarian aid. And so, as both President Yoon and President Biden will say, and their advisors say, the ball is in Kim Jong-un's court. So we're seeing a much different administration in South Korea. And although conservative, from the Conservative People's Party, it really aligns with much of President Biden's administration and the views toward North Korea.
Dave, we got another question here from Mr. Rayet from the Basir Independent Crisis and Independent Crisis Management expert. And he's asking, is the isolation of their science an advantage to the North Koreans? I mean, what are the advantages or disadvantages of their doing that?
That's a great question. I think we're going to see some reports coming out in the future from my good friend Robert Collins, who is actually analyzing the nuclear scientists in North Korea, the human terrain of the technicians and scientists of the nuclear program in North Korea. I think based on your question, I think you're probably asking, it's a double-edged sword. I think the priority of effort and support and resources of these scientists is a good thing. I mean, they are treated very, very well if they're successful. But of course, they do not have the advantage of engaging with international scientists to really cross-level information, share information. Although the North Korean espionage services, of course, are trying to gather information to support their efforts anywhere they can. Just like I think China's research and development program could be called Steal to Leap Ahead. I think North Korea will do their best to steal information, but they're not totally isolated. In fact, after the wall came down and the Cold War ended, there were missile scientists from the former Soviet Union who actually took money to go to North Korea to share their expertise. In fact, some reports are that some of the advances in their missile capabilities came from scientists from the former Soviet Union. And so they're not totally isolated, but for the most part, I think it's fair to say that they remain the most isolated country in the world. And it's a double-edged sword. I'm sure their programs would advance even faster if they had more access to the outside world. But again, Kim Jong-un is really deathly afraid of outside information and outside influence. And so he controls that very tightly.
Mr. Wright has a second question. He says that China is investing in developing in both AI and virtual worlds, and he's asking, are they working together on that? Do you see any sign of collusion or cooperation?
I'm not aware of any directly on AI in that way, although China has long turned a blind eye to what North Korea does. They do, I think, collaborate in some areas, but I don't know if they're really collaborating in depth in that way. I know, of course, that China allows North Korea to operate from its territory to conduct cyber operations and the like. I'm sure there is some cross-leveling of information and certainly at least by by watching what others are doing, that they're learning from each other. And I think this is especially true in the cyber world. And they are, I think North Korea is very, very observant to what's going on around the world, and they try to copy best practices and adapt them for their own use.
Okay. Mr. Schatzer's got another question that kind of aligns with one of mine, so we're going to get to that in a moment. But let me first ask, what would you consider to be the appropriate U.S. national goals in response to the intents that we discussed a little earlier?
Yeah, so I think it is, I hate to be critical of my own country and our government, but I think we're too narrowly focused on denuclearization. Denuclearization, or the nuclear program, is a symptom of the problem. I think we should remember, and we rarely talk about this, but I will state this for the record: my belief that the root of all problems in Korea is the existence of what we call the mafia-like crime family cult, known as the Kim family regime. And as I said, it has the objective of dominating the Korean peninsula under the rule of the guerrilla dynasty and Gulag state. And to add to that, to really get to, what is the durable political arrangement that's going to protect, serve, and advance our interests and advance the interests of the alliance, is really the only way we're going to see an end to the nuclear threat, the existential threat against South Korea, and the human rights abuses and crimes against humanity, is really going to be through the establishment of a stable, secure, peaceful, economically vibrant, non-nuclear peninsula that's unified under a constitutional form of government that is based on democratic principles, liberty, free market economics, human rights, the rule of law, and really determined by the Korean people. Again, a united Republic of Korea. I say all that because we really have to have a long-term objective, a long-term focus beyond just the nuclear problem. And I think, we're coming more and more to the conclusion that Kim Jong-un has no intention of giving up its nuclear program and the nuclear threats and the ICBM threat. Therefore, we've got to manage it until there is change. And I think that the only way that there's going to be change is through internal change in the North, new emerging leadership that will seek another path. I just do not see Kim Jong-un ever changing because, this is the reform paradox. China has tried to get North Korea to reform. China has long argued that North Korea should embark on Chinese-style economic reforms. But to reform is to undermine the legitimacy of the regime. One of the things about the regime is that it has become godlike. Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il are still leaders in the North, even though they're dead, and they retain their titles and their influence. And so to reform means that something was wrong, and they are never going to admit that they were wrong. And to reform undermines their legitimacy. President Trump's mantra was, if Kim Jong-un makes the right strategic decision, North Korea can have a brighter future. Sounds great to us, but both of those, the right strategic decision and a brighter future, are a threat to the regime. Obviously, giving up the nuclear weapons, the right strategic decision from our perspective, that's a threat to the regime. But the brighter future means economic engagement. And with economic engagement comes people-to-people contact, and comes information, and information that will threaten the regime. And so the regime cannot reform. And so we've really got to look beyond the nuclear program and have an acceptable, durable political arrangement on the Korean Peninsula that will bring peace and stability. And that's, again, a free and unified Korea.
Thanks, David. And then in conjunction with the ROC government, what influence could the U.S. government exercise over the DPRK regime in support of those goals that we just identified?
Well, the first and foremost is that we need an information campaign, a strategic influence campaign, strategic influence through information advantage. We have the information advantage. We have the capabilities. And we just have not invested in influencing North Korea. And basically, we need to influence three target audiences. Obviously, the elite. We've got to influence the elite around Kim Jong-un. By continuing to put the pressure on. They're the only ones that will have any hope of changing Kim Jong-un's behavior. Unlikely, but they're the only ones that can do it. The second target audience, really the most important one, is the second-tier leadership. Those outside the regime who have some power, mostly military leaders, security services leaders. Those people need to know that if they don't attack the South, if they don't cause conflict, if they don't allow the escape of weapons of mass destruction, that they have a future in a unified Korea. And that takes influence. The third, of course, is the general population. They must be prepared for unification. And there's a lot of work to be done on that, and a lot of work that can be done, that should be done. But no one has really taken the effort to really focus on that. So an information campaign is really first and foremost. The second is, of course, we talk about maximum pressure. That's a buzzword, a buzz phrase, with a lot of baggage. But really, we need to prevent resources from going to the regime that are used to support nuclear and missile development, used to support the military, and develop those capabilities that threaten the South, the region, and the international community. And so we need a reinvigoration of the Proliferation Security Initiative to prevent North Korea from proliferating weapons that go to that develop hard currency for the regime. We need a focus on the global illicit activities. We need to take down these networks. What is the saying that SOF developed? It takes a network to defeat a network. Our State Department has done some great work in helping countries around the world enforce their laws and enforce international laws. But the fact is, North Korean diplomats are using international law to launder money and to conduct illicit activities. We need to use intelligence and law enforcement collectively in the international community to take down North Korean activities. And we've seen Peru, Mexico, the Philippines, Qatar, Poland have all taken actions against North Korea, really influenced and with the help of our State Department to do that. We need to continue that and develop that on a greater scale. And of course, we need to demonstrate strength and resolve. Again, it's counterintuitive to many, although probably not any on this call. But some people think that we will cause escalation, that we could cause Kim Jong-un to attack. The fact is, or the belief is, my belief is, that Kim Jong-un will not attack into strength unless he has no other opportunity. As long as we are demonstrating strength, resolve, extended deterrence, our commitment to the defense of South Korea, that reduces the likelihood of an attack unless his regime has no other option. He's collapsing, and that could lead him to make that decision. But he is not going to make the deliberate decision to attack into strength. And we should know that because he is working so hard to not only subvert South Korea, but to subvert the alliance. When he talks about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, he is actually talking about ending the alliance. There have been no nuclear weapons in South Korea, U.S. nuclear weapons, since 1991. But we talk about denuclearization of the peninsula. And Kim Jong-un interprets that to mean an end of the alliance, an end of the presence of U.S. forces, an end to extended deterrence and the nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan. And why is that? Because he believes that even if there are not nuclear weapons on the peninsula, the presence of U.S. forces mean that they have access to them and that we will use them. And so he is trying to establish the conditions to split the alliance so that he will be the dominant power on the peninsula. And so that is why we really need to focus on deterrence, the strength of the alliance, and stopping its illicit activities around the world while conducting a strategic influence campaign through information advantage.
Okay, and Dave, we got another question here from George Schatzer. What do you believe are the next likely evolutions in the U.S.-ROK military alliance?
Well, of course, as many of you probably know, that since 2004, we've embarked on a process known as OPCON transition. I don't want to bore everybody with a long history of this, but it's really gone through a number of evolutions. First, the dismantlement of the ROK-US Combined Forces Command into separate warfighting commands, so there would be a lack of unity of command. This changed over time and eventually has evolved to what is now called a conditions-based OPCON transition. Three basic conditions of South Korean advanced warfighting capabilities, missile defense capability, and a sufficient reduction in the threat from the North, which of course is unlikely to happen. But what is really the whole process now is evolved to is not so much OPCON transition, because the Combined Forces Command will remain under the control of both countries equally through the military committee. The U.S. doesn't control South Korean forces, and when the transition occurs, South Korea will not control U.S. forces, but the military committee will control the Combined Forces Command, which will have operational control of both ROK and U.S. forces. And they answer, and as every U.S. commander has said, and in the future, a Korean commander will say, they answer to both presidents equally. But what we've really come down to is a change of command. And at some time in the future, we are going to have a Korean general who is going to command the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. The U.S. commander will be the deputy. He will remain, of course, the U.S. Forces Korea commander, and he will remain the UN commander. And his fourth hat is the senior U.S. military officer in Korea as a member, a permanent member of the military committee with the chairman of the ROK JCS, which provides the oversight of the Combined Forces Command. And so this is really the evolution of the future. Now, some say this will not occur. Others say it will occur. My argument is it needs to occur. And why is that? Because if we conduct operations inside North Korea, either war or for instability, regime collapse, large-scale humanitarian assistance, the ultimate outcome for the military will have to be military support to the unification process, a political process. I believe this needs to be led by a Korean commander, because if it's led by a UN commander, we will give the perception that it is the US occupying North Korea. And we want to prevent that. We want to prevent Afghanistan, Iraq, in Korea, and the perception of the US as an occupying force. Now, we can support our ally, which I believe we should, but the Combined Forces Command should be led by a Korean general to establish the legitimacy, the long-term legitimacy of a united Republic of Korea. And so that's why I believe we should do it. It also sends other powerful messages to other allies around the world, meaning that we do not have to always demand that we are in charge or that we lead a military alliance, even though NATO and other alliances, we always tend to put ourselves in command. In Korea, I think it's time for a change, and I think we can do that, and we can do that very well. But that is a very controversial topic, but it is one that is really part of strategic influence as well.
Hey, let's we've talked about the kind of influence that we think the U.S. government, maybe in coordination with the ROK government, would want to exercise over the DPRK. With what information activities might DoD tasked to help support this?
Well, I think that I think North Korea is a laboratory for psychological operations. I think every psychological operator should be thirsting, should be mouth watering to try to conduct psychological operations in the North. But we need to operate through, with, and by. We really need to enable our ROK counterparts. We can conduct combined operations. And there are so many things that we can do. Interestingly, and this audience might appreciate this, George Hutchinson, retired Air Force officer who is working in Korea now, getting his PhD at George Mason, just wrote a great report about influence within the North Korean People's Army. Surprisingly, one of the things that still continue to influence in North Korea, particularly the military in the frontline areas, are leaflets. Leaflets still have an effect. They are picked up, they are read, and sometimes the only method of communication. So, it may seem anachronistic. We all want to think about advanced capabilities, but leaflets still have a role, and we should keep that in mind. That said, as I've talked about, there are advanced communications capabilities in the North, and the Korean people in the North are hungry for information. They want outside information, and so many things that we have done around the world, developing radio programs and videos, all kinds of programs, that has great value in North Korea. We should also study Voice of America, Radio Free Asia. They have tremendous reach inside North Korea. I I participate in a weekly television show for Voice of America called Washington Talk that's broadcast directly into North Korea for the elite in Pyongyang. And every week, different people participate in trying to explain U.S. policy toward North Korea. And it really offers us an opportunity to try to influence. And so there are things that we are doing, but there's so much more that we can do that has influence. I just make one more point. Videos and things like Netflix Crash Landing on You. If you've ever watched that, I'm sure many people have watched that Korean drama. That is having an effect inside North Korea. I met with 7 former North Korean soldiers just before COVID. One of them was the escapee through Panmunjom who was shot and survived. And I asked them how they were viewing Crash Landing on You, how the Korean soldiers are viewing it. And one of them said that it makes them want to come to the South even more. But one of the things about that video that has such an impact on the North is that it portrayed the Korean soldiers as human beings, which was quite controversial in the South. The conservatives in the South do not like that. They want to paint North Korea as all bad. But the fact that they showed them as human beings that have feelings and have romantic feelings and live as normal people want to live and survive, that's had an impact on Korean soldiers in the North. And the reason is because they have never, ever seen anything produced by their own government that ever portrayed any outsider, especially South Koreans, in any positive manner. And the fact that South Korea portrayed North Korean soldiers in a positive manner really had an influence. And that is I think a key point on influence operations that we really need to focus on, not just vilifying Kim Jong-un or the military or the way of life in North Korea. We need to show the humanity that does exist, and that has a real influence.
Dave, the 2022 National Defense Strategy also acknowledges that mutually beneficial alliances and partnerships are an enduring strength for the United States, and that the department will incorporate ally and partner perspectives, competencies, and advantages at every stage of defense planning. Given this consideration, what information activities could be conducted by South Korean or United Nations sending state forces?
Well, I think that's a great question. And I think, first, South Korea has to change their policy, which I think will happen under the Yoon administration. They actually tried to stop the escapees and defectors from launching their balloons and sending thumb drives and other things into North Korea. So South Korea has to stop that. Second, they need to let slip the PSYOP dogs of war and allow their PSYOP forces and U.S. PSYOP forces to conduct psychological operations. It is really necessary and it should be done. But that said, there is so much more that can be done outside of the military and outside of the government. And the sending states can play a role in that. Not so much centralized control, by certainly not by the United Nations Command or by the Combined Forces Command or the ROC government, but the idea that outside information is a positive benefit for the people inside North Korea, that should encourage people to try to send information into North Korea. Which is one quick point. A lot of people will say, we create a moral hazard when we send information into North Korea. The fact that if you get caught with information from the outside world, you could be tried, convicted, and severely punished, up to and including execution. I often ask escapees how they feel about that. I said, do you understand the risk? They said every Korean in North Korea knows the risk, and yet they're willing to take it. One escapee told me that he was caught with a South Korean video. He was severely punished. His phone was taken away. His lost all his money, and of course, okay, stop watching South Korean video. He said that 5 days later, he couldn't take it anymore and he wanted to watch it again. And he was willing to do that, and watch South Korean videos with his friends. And so I think that really tells you the risks that the Korean people in the North are willing to go to get outside information. And we should help them. And lastly, I'll say, again, we have a moral obligation. The United Nations Commission of Inquiry in 2014 said one of the worst human rights abuses is the regime preventing information from the outside world. And it calls on the international community to provide information to the people inside North Korea. So the sending states, they can look to that UN Commission of Inquiry as justification for trying to help the Korean people in the North get access to information.
David, William Thoyer has a question that actually I'm going to ask next. So again, I'm kind of glad to see that many of us are on the same sheet of music here. Given Elon Musk's support of Ukraine with his Starlink system, are there other non-military or even commercial entities whose activities might support U.S. government and ROK government objectives?
Yes, I think there are. I've heard of companies like Google and other technology companies wanting to try to get access information into North Korea. I had one company asked for some advice, and they wanted to fly drones into North Korea, and with communication devices and things like that. My response was, well, I think if you send a drone either from China or from South Korea, it might be viewed as a threat by the North Koreans, which could have some unwanted second and third order effects. But the fact is that there are companies out there with technologies that could have application inside North Korea, and we should. I would love to see us put into low Earth orbit, geosynchronous satellites over North Korea to be able to beam down access to the internet somehow. I'm not a technical expert, but I'm sure that there are companies that can do that. And then of course providing devices to the people could be could be a game changer. So I think that we really need civil society to step up, as many have, mostly working with escapees or defectors, but to step up and try to use their advanced technology and capabilities to get information inside North Korea. And the government of South Korea and the regional governments, China being accepted, should allow that to happen.
Okay, and again, another question that Mr. Thoyer and I kind of agree on: what resources does the DoD currently have that could conduct the information activities with which it could be tasked? And also, he was a little more specific. What entities are responsible for cyber analysis, reconnaissance, and blockchain ledger tracking? Where are the resources for such activities allocated?
Well, I have to punt on that one and defer. I think I would go to Cybercom and NSA for those types of analysis. That's really beyond my area of expertise. But I will say those are good questions, and that's what needs to happen. I think between state, Treasury, NSA, Cybercom, that we need to be tracking those blockchain activities. I mean, we've did arrest someone recently for going to North Korea, providing information on blockchain and Bitcoin. So those can be sanctioned activities, but the exact technical capabilities, I'm sure they exist within our government, and we need to really harness them. Now, I just say, before we get too close to the end here, in addition to the National Defense Strategy talking about allies and the importance of allies, which I'm heartened to see DoD and our administration so focused on that, because I agree allies are critically important to our national security. I'd also talked about integrated deterrence and campaigning. And integrated deterrence, is really taking a broader approach than just the military to deterrence. And I'd like to call it nuclear deterrence, conventional deterrence, and I would use Bob Jones' unconventional deterrence, about holding a population at risk, in resistance, like the resistance operating concept. But I would have those three pillars of integrated deterrence. But the last one, campaigning, is really key. And I think that this is where we really have to focus on developing a strategic influence campaign, a holistic campaign that, of course, applies DoD assets, broader government assets, ROK government, ROK military assets, but also empowers and enables and encourages civil society to use their resources to do this. Now, we can't control them. Non-governmental organizations think tanks, private organizations, individuals, but we can establish an environment that encourages, enables, and empowers people to take action. And the most important action is getting information into inside North Korea to the Korean people who are suffering in the north.
Okay, and Dave, got a question here from Jove, and he says, please provide your recommendations on preparing our SOF, especially CA and PSYOP, to achieve those information warfare goals in the Korean Peninsula.
Well, first, I think you've got to do a deep dive in trying to understand the Korean society, the Korean system, the Korean history, the Korean culture. You've got to be, I mean, this is really the information domain. And I think that, I also think that whatever happens on the Korean Peninsula is going to be the largest through, with, and by operation we've ever conducted, because it is really about enabling our allies to be successful and ultimately achieving a united Republic of Korea. It's not Iraq and Afghanistan, unless we make the same mistakes that we did there. South Korea provides a very unique opportunity, and the division of the peninsula provides a deep opportunity. But we've got to focus on the human domain. We've got to focus on the indigenous approach inside North Korea. And we've got to really understand that. And some of the questions are that I like to ask, who's mapping the human terrain inside North Korea? Do we know, who is, the governing structures all the way down to the village level? How do they function? Do we know the three military chains of control, which that really organizes the North Korean military? You have the traditional chain of control from general to private. You have the political chain of control, like all communist countries, communist militaries. And you have a third, the security chain of control, again, from general to private, every organization. Do we understand that? What are the best practices for co-opting and for coercion inside North Korea? What is really going to work? That needs to be really studied in depth. What are the population and resources control measures that are being employed inside North Korea to control the population? There's a lot of work to be done on what's been happening for the last 2 years with the paradox of COVID. North Korea is deathly afraid of COVID, but it has provided an opportunity to further oppress the people and to really tamp down any possible resistance. That needs to be understood. We need to understand the market activity, the 400 markets that have risen from the arduous march, the Great Famine, that really allowed the Korean people in the north to survive. And the regime is cracking down on them. There's not going to be a safety mechanism, a safety valve for the people as they head into another famine that is likely to occur. Conditions are getting really bad inside North Korea. We've got to understand that. We've got to identify the key communicators inside and outside the government, harness the power of the escapees, the defectors. I've proposed establishing a Korean Defector Information Institute to cull from the 33,000 escapees or defectors, those who are key communicators, those who have legitimacy, those who know how to communicate with the Korean people in the north. We need to really exploit that. And then, of course, we've got to understand the South Korean plans for unification and help the South Korean communicators, their psychological operations, their government officials to be able to translate those plans into a strategy, but into information to inform, educate the Korean people in the north. So those are some of the things that we should really be focusing on. I've got many more to talk about an information influence campaign, and I can go on forever.
Well, Dave, we actually got a couple more questions from the audience. George Schatzer asks, what recent books on the Kim Jong-un regime and its strategy might you recommend?
Everyone should read Kang Dong-oh's, Katie Oh, and Ralph Hassig, her husband, her new book on Korea. It just came out last year, and it is an excellent, very readable book that gives insights into Korean history, culture, and the current problems. So that book is one. Dr. Jung Pak wrote Becoming Kim Jong-un, which is probably the best biography on Kim Jong-un himself. That is one that should be read. there are many more. I call your attention to the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. There's many reports that talk about the societal structure, Songbun, which Robert Collins wrote, which is the seminal work. It was written in 2012, but it is still applicable. And combined with that, I would recommend a fiction book by Adam Johnson, who won the Pulitzer Prize, and it is The Orphan Master's Son. It's got a far-fetched plot, but it's fascinating, and it's weaved throughout the book is weaved the way North Korean society operates. And I like to say that fictional book operationalizes the academic work that Bob Collins has done on Songbun and the 51 classes of society. So that's a good fiction book that will really, is really interesting and not a boring book that will really educate you about the society. I've actually got a long list of readings and reports and people that you should refer to that I could provide. I don't know if that can be disseminated through JSOW, but for those interested, I prepare a long list for people who are going to serve in Korea or work on the Korean problem, and I've laid out my recommendations for that, and I'm happy to provide that any way I can. Anybody can reach out to me as well.
Dave, William Thoyer asks, how frequently does leadership travel, to what locations, and what access does that allow?
I'm sure you're talking about North Korean leadership, and there's really only one leader that is to really understand, and that's Kim Jong-un. Mostly he travels internally between Pyongyang and his villa, his childhood villa in Wonsan on the East Coast. We know he spent a lot of time there. They have leadership villas in the north along the Chinese border that are up there, but mostly he spends his time between Pyongyang and Wonsan. Often we don't know where he is, at least from open source reporting. Now, he's only traveled to a couple places, and really 3 places he's traveled to outside. He's been to Beijing, he's been to Vietnam, to Singapore, and then a 4th place, Russia. He went to Vladivostok. So those are the 4 trips that he's really made. And he did cross Panmunjom into and have a meeting in the Peace House with both President Moon and with President Trump. But really, Vietnam, China, Singapore, and Russia are the only places that he's traveled to. Unlike his father, Kim Jong-il, who didn't travel at all, is very isolated as well. So those are the places that we know about that he's traveled. But he hasn't traveled since 2019. 2018, his last trip was to Hanoi in February 2019.